Barbara, are you suggesting that perhaps we need to also shift the debate and look at the protesters themselves and the fact that perhaps their first option is always violent protest as opposed to normal civil protest, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to unpack that. We need to understand why that's the case. And it's not rocket science to work it out. I mean, I think it is because people don't feel that they're a part of a collective future that's getting better.
All right. Sorry to interrupt you, because I think there will certainly be a discussion about that, and I asked the minister a couple of days about exactly the same thing, Minister Richard Baloyi. But the other issue, though, related to that is that there are protests elsewhere in the world. You would have seen the riots in London recently, but police are equipped to deal with these protests regardless of whether or not they are violent, because you would never have seen a Dadane-type situation in London simply because there is a certain level of training given to the police ahead of those kind of situations.
Well, I think the police did a terrible job in London. I mean, I don't think they did a fabulous job at all. But I don't think that they have the history that we have. I mean, I think the point about the transformation, and we can argue about whether it was a name change, I saw some very real efforts towards transformation of the police over the last 15 years. But I think one of the big issues there is that we are using the police again in exactly the same way as we did before 94 to suppress public dissatisfaction, and that makes it very hard. It confuses the relationship between the police and the communities they serve. Having been told for many years that they need to be representative of those communities and they need to see themselves as being part of those communities, how do they in fact address this themselves with integrity when they are now put again into that position where somehow they are separated from the communities from which they come? I
think that's a very important point, and let's test it then with Captain Adriao. How do you respond to those points then, Captain?
Thank you, Talani. And thanks to Barbara. I think Barbara brought up some very valid points that I would have brought up as well. I agree with Barbara. There has been major transformation within the South African Police Service, and specifically with our public order police. And, we have sent our officers worldwide to research the best practices and try and benchmark the best possible training. And that we've given our police officers even prior to the 2010 World Cup. If you remember, we had members of the French in South Africa giving our public order police members training specifically to bring our standards and training methods to international standards. And it's worked very, very well. And I think we need to also bear in mind that it has been protest marches that have been peaceful. There's been no heavy-handed action at all from the police. We've policed it as would be required to. Unfortunately, we sit with virtually every single day a number of very violent protests where people not only throw stones at our police officers, fire rounds at our police officers, burn down municipal buildings and vehicles, put other lives in danger, and that necessitates our members to act. And, I know that the minister has made a number of comments, and I know that we're busy with internally, relooking and seeing what we can do in terms of public order policing module, looking in terms of capacity and equipment. We've bought water cannons, we use tear gas, rubber bullets when necessary, but the level of force that we use is obviously dependent on the violence that is exerted by the protesters. Our intention, obviously, is to disperse the protesters, and what we always try and do is initiate some talking. We try and identify the leaders and talk to the leaders and find out what is it, that we can say or do to calm the situation before we even resort to any sort of dispersing methods. And what we find is frustrating is that these protesters are angry because of promises that were given either through authorities or whatever the case might be. And then we, from the police, obviously, we have an obligation in terms of the law to act when property and violence is taking place on our streets.
Well, I don't agree.
And if you mentioned London, London riots went on for a few days, and in France as well, in Paris, in the city centre, went on for a few days, and a lot of people questioned their capacity and capability of dealing with riots. We've been fortunate that when we act, we also try and institute a communication channel between the leaders of those protesters and our police members, because community policing is the essence of in South Africa.
Yeah.
We can't be greeting the community the one day and then the next day firing tear gas to disperse them because they're building municipal buildings down. So we try and initiate meetings to address the problem that's being created that's actually resulted in this violent protest marches.
Okay. All right. You know what? I'll open the lines, by the way, on 0891 104 208. I've got a lot of SMSs that are coming through at 34701 and emails at gwalax@sabc.co.za. Let's find out what people think about this. It's an important issue, clearly, because there are these protests. And if you look at the numbers, the protests, I think since 2009 in particular, somebody made or somebody gave us these stats that they probably would have doubled the number of protests that took place since 2004. So it is going to happen. It happens on a daily basis. How then should these issues be dealt with? 0891 104 208. I know that Hassan wanted to come in and you were saying you would disagree with some of what the captain was saying.
Well, only as far as I think that the mandate of the police as to they have to, in fact, my experience working with Public Services International in the early 90s was that Swedish unions, for example, had to protect progressive people to march because neo-Nazis were also marching at the same time. So I think what must happen here, the police must not only look at the one right in the Constitution, property, they should look at people also fulfilling the other rights, the right to food, etc., and people need to do that. And if someone throws a stone from there, clearly this is what progressive policing is about, is to make sure that it doesn't result in deaths of people. I mean, the ICD reports are filled of how many people have died in police custody, under the hands of the police. So quite clearly, these figures will embarrass figures under apartheid, and that's sad.
But again, having said that, Hassan, the issue that my two other guests are raising is the violent nature of the protests in this country. That it's not about.
You see, this is the point I'm saying to you. I admit some of them are. They want to attract attention, so we've got to deal with the causes of it. But the violence of hunger, desperation, being marginalized, all that is also a form of violence. Don't only look at the stone throw. That's the end product. So to be proactive means that the police must talk to communities, but also to the power holders.
But it is possible that police are caught between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, because you then have these people who, without talking, are violent, and you've got to make sure that you maintain order. And how else do you respond to violence other than perhaps being strong-handed or heavy-handed?
I don't agree. I mean, the police have a mandate to respond, to be of service to the communities and to respond to those people that we have elected. So they've got a delicate balance to point out. But oftentimes, when people just say, you heard the email about mining villages and that, they seem, some of them tend to think that their job is to protect the rich or those who have against those who do not have. The police cannot resolve this on their own. It's a political problem.
Barbara?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. I'm not suggesting that it is the protesters who initiate violence from nowhere. I think that the whole system is extremely violent, and I agree that marginalization is as violent as it gets. What I'm saying, though, is that what we seem to be doing is coming back full circle, where instead of addressing those issues, and I really do believe that it's about whether or not those who are marginalized have any sense that where we're moving towards is a place that's better for them. And that conversation isn't happening. And because it isn't happening, the journey towards it being better for them is probably not happening. And I think there needs to be a relationship of trust established, not just between the police and communities, but where the communities see themselves as a part of what is happening in South Africa and of a future that brings some hope. We know that people who have no hope are much more likely to vandalize, to be violent, to express that hope through actions that reflect deep depression and anxiety and sadness and grief. And that's not a good place for us to be in our society. I think that what's very sad from a policing perspective is that because they then hit the front line of all of that emotion, we judge their performance by it, whereas I think that we should be judging our police performance against a degree of difficulty that is really outrageous. If we look at the international models, I always say of people like the Norwegian police, if our police went to Norway, they would do an absolutely fabulous job. If the Norwegian police, who are highly regarded as absolutely, as they say, best practice, came to Johannesburg, they'd run away screaming. What we're asking our police to do is extraordinarily far beyond the limits of what they can possibly deliver.
Because probably some of it is not policing, it's about, and this is the SMS that's coming through here. I'm going to get responses from you in a second. There's an SMS from Julius Kwamhlanga, for instance, who says, politicians mess up and leave police to clean up. If there was service delivery, police would be left to catch criminals. Is that the core of what is happening, would you say? Perhaps, Captain, I'm not sure, this is a political question, I'm not sure if the Captain would want to respond there.
Well, yeah, you're putting me in a tight spot there. But what I would say is that, the people are protesting for specific issues and specific reasons. And probably because authorities, or whoever the case might be, that have been promising or that have been talking to them haven't fulfilled what they, required them to do. So protesters obviously become more and more violent and angry and dissatisfied about what's taking place and take to the streets. But I also just wanted to add that, police officers come from those communities. And I think that we mustn't forget that our members stay in those communities. So when a police officer has to act, you must remember that when we talk about community, it's not the whole community that's protesting and being violent. It's usually a small core of members that are the violent groupings that go and burn down the council buildings or vehicles in the street. And our members have to act, in terms of, you're right, our mandate, but we also, as much as we want to comply with constitutional rights of somebody to march and voice their dissatisfaction about whatever the case might be, we also need to bear in mind that the destruction of property and putting people's lives in danger will not be tolerated. So that has to be respected, the right to march, but then again, the rights of the police to act once criminal acts start coming into play.